What happens when a legendary martial arts icon meets Hollywood's most provocative late-night host? You won't believe what unfolds when respect collides with ego in the most explosive talk show confrontation ever captured on live television. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below, because you're not going to believe what unfolds when Chuck Norris steps into Jimmy Kimmel's world and everything goes sideways. Last night's episode of Jimmy Kimmel Live started like any other. The studio audience was buzzing with anticipation as they welcomed martial arts legend Chuck Norris to the show. What seemed like a routine celebrity interview quickly transformed into a powder keg of tension that would leave viewers stunned, and social media exploding with reactions. The trouble began the moment Norris walked onto the set. Instead of the usual warm greeting that guests expect, Kimmel's opening was laced with subtle mockery. "Well, well, well, look who decided to grace us with his presence," Kimmel said with that trademark smirk. "Chuck Norris, the man who supposedly once counted to infinity twice. Though I'm guessing that's about as real as your recent political statements." The audience laughed nervously, but Norris's expression remained stone cold. Years of discipline and self-control were evident in his posture as he took his seat. But those who knew him could see the slight tightening around his eyes. The martial arts master had faced down countless opponents in his career, but this felt different. This was personal. "Thanks for having me, Jimmy," Norris replied evenly, his voice carrying that familiar gravelly tone that had intimidated villains on screen for decades. "Though I have to say, I expected a bit more professionalism from someone in your position." The comment hung in the air like a challenge. Kimmel's smile faltered for just a fraction of a second before returning. But it was different now. Sharper, more predatory. "Professionalism? That's rich coming from someone who spent the last few years spreading conspiracy theories on social media. Tell me, Chuck, when exactly did you decide that being a tough guy on screen qualified you to be a political commentator?" The studio fell silent. This wasn't the playful banter that audiences expected from late-night television. This was something else entirely. A verbal sparring match between two men who clearly had very different ideas about respect and responsibility. Norris leaned back in his chair, his hands folded calmly in his lap, but his eyes never left Kimmel's face. "You know, Jimmy, I've been in this business for over 50 years. I've worked with professionals, and I've worked with amateurs. I've learned to tell the difference pretty quickly." The insult was delivered with surgical precision, wrapped in the kind of calm delivery that made it even more devastating. Kimmel's jaw tightened, and for a moment, the mask of the jovial host slipped completely. The audience could sense the shift in energy. This wasn't entertainment anymore. This was two alpha males circling each other, looking for weaknesses. "Is that so?" Kimmel shot back, his voice taking on a harder edge. "Well, since we're talking about professionalism, let's discuss your recent comments about vaccines and government conspiracies. Don't you think someone with your platform has a responsibility not to spread dangerous misinformation to impressionable fans?" The question was loaded with condescension, delivered with the kind of moral superiority that made Norris's blood pressure spike. He'd dealt with critics before, but there was something particularly grating about Kimmel's approach, the way he wielded his late-night platform like a weapon while hiding behind the guise of comedy. "Dangerous misinformation?" Norris repeated, his voice growing colder. "You mean like the dangerous misinformation that comes from someone who makes jokes about serious issues every night while pretending to be a news source? At least I'm honest about my opinions, Jimmy. I don't hide behind a laugh track." The tension in the studio was becoming palpable. Audience members were shifting uncomfortably in their seats, unsure whether to laugh or hold their breath. This wasn't the kind of controlled controversy that late-night shows usually trafficked in. This was raw, unfiltered animosity between two men who had clearly reached the end of their patience with each other. Kimmel's producer was frantically gesturing from the wings, trying to signal for a commercial break, but Kimmel was too far gone. to notice. He was locked in combat now, and his ego wouldn't let him back down. Honest? You call spreading conspiracy theories about election fraud honest? You call questioning the expertise of medical professionals honest? Chuck, you're a martial artist, not a doctor or a political scientist. The condescension in Kimmel's voice was unmistakable now, and Norris felt something snap inside him. Decades of maintaining his composure, of being the consummate professional, suddenly felt like a straitjacket. He'd come on this show as a courtesy, expecting the basic respect that any guest deserved, and instead he was being treated like a target in Kimmel's personal vendetta against anyone who disagreed with his worldview. "You know what, Jimmy?" Norris said, his voice dropping to that dangerous whisper that anyone who'd seen his movies would recognize. "I think we need to have a real conversation about respect." And that's when everything changed. The words hung in the air like a loaded gun, and suddenly the entire atmosphere in the studio shifted. Kimmel, perhaps sensing he'd pushed too far, tried to regain control with his usual deflection tactics. "Oh, here we go," he said with a nervous laugh. "The tough guy routine. What are you going to do, Chuck? Roundhouse kick me into submission?" But Norris wasn't playing along with the joke. He stood up slowly, deliberately, his movements carrying the fluid grace of someone who'd spent a lifetime mastering the art of controlled violence. The audience collectively held its breath as the martial arts legend rose to his full height, his presence suddenly dominating the small talk show set. "Sit down, Chuck," Kimmel said, but his voice had lost its earlier cockiness. There was something in Norris's eyes now that made the host acutely aware that this wasn't just another celebrity guest he could bully with impunity. "This is my show, and you're here as my guest." "Your guest?" Norris repeated, his voice carrying a dangerous edge that made several audience members actually lean back in their seats. "Is that what you call someone you invite on your show just to humiliate them? Because from where I'm standing, it looks more like you brought me here to be your punching bag." The production crew was in full panic mode now. Cameras were still, rolling, capturing every moment of what was rapidly becoming the most intense confrontation in late-night television history. The director was frantically trying to decide whether to cut to commercial or keep filming what could either be career-ending or career-defining television. Kimmel tried to regain his composure, falling back on the snark that had made him famous. "Oh, please, Chuck. You're being a little dramatic, don't you think? This is how interviews work. I ask questions, you answer them. Sorry if you can't handle a little pushback on your questionable opinions." That was the wrong thing to say. Norris took a step closer to the desk, and suddenly the physical dynamics of the situation became crystal clear. Here was a man who had dedicated his entire life to the study of combat, facing off against a talk show host who'd never been in a real fight in his life. The contrast was stark and uncomfortable. Questionable opinions? Norris's voice was getting quieter, which somehow made it more menacing. "Jimmy, I've served my country. I've entertained millions of people, and I've always conducted myself with honor and dignity. Can you say the same? Or do you just hide behind your writers and your audience and tear people down for ratings?" The accusation hit home harder than Kimmel expected. For a moment his mask slipped completely, revealing something raw and defensive underneath. "I don't hide behind anything," he snapped, his voice rising. "I use my platform to call out people who spread dangerous lies to vulnerable people. That's called responsibility, something you might want to look into." "Responsibility?" Norris laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "You want to talk about responsibility? How about taking responsibility for ambushing your guests? How about taking responsibility for turning what should be a respectful conversation into a character assassination? How about taking responsibility for the fact that you've forgotten what it means to be a decent human being?" The studio audience was completely silent now, sensing that they were witnessing something unprecedented. This wasn't scripted drama or manufactured controversy. This was two men having a genuine confrontation, and the raw emotion was palpable. Some audience members were pulling out their phones, trying to capture the moment, while others simply stared in shocked fascination. Kimmel's face was flushed now, his earlier smugness replaced by genuine anger. "Don't lecture me about being decent, Chuck. You're the one who's been spreading conspiracy theories and undermining public health. You're the one who's been poisoning the minds of your fans with your paranoid nonsense. And now you want to play the victim because I called you out on it? Called me out?" Norris's voice was dangerously quiet now. "Is that what you call this ambush? This character assassination? Jimmy, if you had a problem with something I said, you could have addressed it like a professional. Instead, you decided to turn your show into a kangaroo court with you as judge, jury, and executioner." The martial arts legend moved closer to the desk, and Kimmel instinctively rolled his chair back. The power dynamic in the room had shifted. Completely. This wasn't a host controlling his guest anymore. This was a predator and prey situation, and everyone in the studio could feel it. "You know what your problem is, Jimmy?" Norris continued, his voice carrying the weight of decades of experience and disappointment. "You've forgotten that there are real people behind the opinions you mock. You've forgotten that respect isn't something you can just turn on and off when it's convenient. You've forgotten that being a host means being a host, not a prosecutor." But Kimmel wasn't backing down. His ego was too invested now, and the cameras were still rolling. In a moment that would define his career, he made the decision that would change everything. "You know what, Chuck?" Kimmel said, his voice dripping with venom as he leaned forward in his chair. "Maybe the problem isn't my hosting style. Maybe the problem is that you're just another washed-up action star who can't handle the fact that nobody takes you seriously anymore. Maybe the problem is that you're so desperate for relevance that you'll say anything, no matter how dangerous or stupid, just to get attention." The words hit the studio like a physical blow. Even the crew members who had seen Kimmel at his most cutting gasped audibly. This wasn't just unprofessional, it was deliberately cruel, designed to wound and humiliate. The host had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, and everyone in the room knew it. Norris went completely still. For a moment, the only sound in the studio was the low hum of the cameras and the barely audible breathing of a terrified audience. When he finally spoke, his voice was so quiet that the boom operator had to strain to pick it up. "What did you just say to me?" The question carried more menace than any threat could have. It was the voice of a man who had reached his absolute limit, who had been pushed beyond the boundaries of civilized discourse into something primal and dangerous. Kimmel, perhaps realizing he'd gone too far, tried to backtrack with his usual smirk, but the damage was done. "I said what everyone's thinking, Chuck. You're a relic. A has-been who's trying to stay relevant by pandering to conspiracy theorists and anti-vaxxers. And honestly, it's kind of pathetic." The silence that followed was deafening. Audience members were looking at each other in shock, some covering their mouths in disbelief. The production staff was frozen, unsure whether to intervene or let this train wreck continue to unfold. This was television history being made, but not the kind anyone would want to be remembered for. Norris took another step forward, and now he was close enough to the desk that Kimmel had to crane his neck to look up at him. The physical intimidation was undeniable, but it was the controlled fury in the martial arts legend's eyes that truly unsettled everyone watching. "Pathetic," Norris repeated, his voice still dangerously quiet. "You want to know what's pathetic, Jimmy? What's pathetic is a grown man who makes his living by tearing other people down. What's pathetic is someone who hides behind comedy when he wants to say something cruel. What's pathetic is a host who treats his guests like enemies instead of human beings." Kimmel was trapped now, backed into a corner by his own arrogance and cruelty. He could feel the judgment of everyone in the room, could sense that he'd lost the moral high ground completely. But instead of admitting his mistake, instead of trying to salvage the situation with grace, he doubled down. "Oh, spare me the moral lecture," Kimmel shot back, his voice shaking with a mixture of fear and defiance. "You come on my show spouting conspiracy theories and misinformation, and when I call you out on it, suddenly I'm the bad guy? You're the one who's been irresponsible, Chuck. You're the one who's been dangerous. And if you can't handle being held accountable for that, then maybe you shouldn't be on television at all." The accusation hung in the air like poison. Norris stared down at the host for a long moment, and everyone in the studio could see the internal struggle playing out across his features. Here was a man who had built his entire career on discipline and self-control, being pushed to the very edge of his restraint by someone who seemed determined to provoke him into losing his composure. "Held accountable?" Norris said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Jimmy, you want to talk about accountability? Let's talk about how you've turned your platform into a weapon. Let's talk about how you've forgotten that the people you mock and belittle are human beings with feelings and dignity. Let's talk about how you've become everything that's wrong with modern media." The host tried one more time to regain control, to turn this back into the kind of controlled controversy he was comfortable with. "Look, Chuck, if you can't handle the heat of a real interview, maybe you should stick to infomercials and reality shows. This is how journalism works in the real world." That was the final straw. The comparison to journalism, the dismissal of his career, the complete lack of respect or basic human decency. It all crystallized in that moment into something that demanded a response. Norris straightened to his full height, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of decades of experience and disappointment. "Journalism?" he said, and there was something almost pitying in his tone now. "Jimmy, what you do isn't journalism. It's character assassination disguised as entertainment. And you know what? I've had enough." The martial arts legend turned away from the desk, but this wasn't a retreat. This was something else entirely. The calm before a storm that would shake the very foundations of late-night television. Norris walked slowly toward the center of the stage, his movements deliberate and controlled. The studio lights caught the silver in his hair, but there was nothing frail or diminished about his presence. If anything, he seemed to grow larger, more imposing, as he distanced himself from Kimmel's desk. When he finally turned back to face the host, his expression was one of profound disappointment mixed with steely resolve. "You know, Jimmy," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the now silent studio, "I came here tonight as a professional courtesy. I came here to promote my projects, to connect with fans, and to have what I hoped would be a respectful conversation. Instead, I've been subjected to what can only be described as a public humiliation designed to boost your ratings at my expense." Kimmel, perhaps sensing that he'd lost complete control of the situation, made one last desperate attempt to salvage his position. "Chuck, look, maybe we got off on the wrong foot here. Why don't we start over? We can—" "No." The word cut through Kimmel, stammering like a blade. "We're not starting over. We're ending this. Right now." Norris's voice was calm, but it carried an authority that made everyone in the studio understand that this was not a negotiation. "I've been in this business for over 5 decades, and I've worked with everyone from B-movie directors to A-list stars. I've been respectful to every host, every interviewer, every person who's given me their time. But respect is a two-way street, Jimmy, and you've shown me tonight that you don't understand that basic principle." The cameras continued to roll as Norris began to remove his microphone, his movements methodical and final. "You see, there's something you don't seem to understand about respect, Jimmy. It's not something you earn through ratings or fame or the power to mock people on television. It's something you demonstrate through how you treat others, especially when you think no one is watching." Kimmel tried to interject again, his voice rising with panic. "Chuck, please, let's just calm down and—" "I am calm," Norris replied, and the truth of that statement was somehow more terrifying than any display of anger could have been. "I'm perfectly calm. What I am is disappointed. Disappointed that someone with your platform would use it to tear people down instead of building them up. Disappointed that you've forgotten that behind every guest you mock is a real person with real feelings and real dignity. The martial arts legend placed his microphone carefully on the edge of Kimmel's desk, the small gesture somehow carrying more weight than any dramatic flourish could have. You asked me earlier about responsibility, Jimmy. Well, here's my responsibility. I refuse to participate in this charade any longer. I refuse to be part of a show that values cruelty over kindness, mockery over respect. As Norris began to walk toward the stage exit, Kimmel made one final desperate play for control. You can't just walk out in the middle of my show. This is live television. You're under contract. Norris stopped and turned back one last time, and when he smiled, it was the same enigmatic expression that had made him a legend on screen. Jimmy, I've broken boards with my bare hands, I've taken down opponents twice my size, and I've survived decades in Hollywood. Do you really think a television contract is going to stop me from leaving when I've been disrespected? The audience began to murmur, some breaking into spontaneous applause as they realized they were witnessing something unprecedented in television history. This wasn't just a guest walking off a show. This was a masterclass in dignity under fire, a demonstration of how to maintain your principles even when under attack. You know what the real tragedy is here? Norris continued, his voice carrying over the growing audience response. You had the opportunity to have a real conversation tonight. You could have asked me about my career, my family, my projects, my philosophy. Instead, you chose to turn this into an ambush, and in doing so, you've shown everyone watching exactly what kind of host you really are. With that, Chuck Norris walked off the Jimmy Kimmel Live stage, leaving behind a stunned audience, a shell-shocked host, and what would become the most talked-about moment in late-night television history. The cameras continued rolling as Kimmel sat in stunned silence, the weight of what had just happened slowly sinking in. Within hours, social media exploded with reactions to the confrontation. Respect Chuck Norris began trending worldwide as viewers shared clips of the legendary martial artist's dignified exit. Talk show hosts across the industry were forced to examine their own interview techniques, and media critics debated whether Kimmel had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. The incident became a defining moment not just for both men involved, but for the entire entertainment industry, a reminder that respect, dignity, and professionalism should never be sacrificed for ratings, and that sometimes the most powerful response to cruelty is simply to walk away with your head held high.